Most of us are familiar with the basic teaching of evolution, the belief that everything around us gradually changed from nothing to what it is today, over very long periods of time. By saying very long periods of time, evolutionists mean billions of years. That is billions, with a B. But not many people know when, or where, or who started that concept. So, let's talk about the evolution of evolution. Its history is very complicated. We will just touch on a few of its milestones. You may be surprised by its beginning. If you want to dig into the details, consider reading the book titled The Long War Against God by Dr. Henry Morris. To work our way back to its origin, we need to get into a time machine and go back into the past. So, here we go. Darwin usually gets the credit for originating evolution. So we will start when he was alive, and then go back in time to see where this philosophy really started. Although Charles Darwin wasn't the original source for these ideas, he was successful at flipping the common view of nature upside down. Before Darwin, nature was typically seen as an exquisite ecosystem wonderfully designed to fit its many pieces together perfectly. Darwin portrayed nature as the force making all natural organisms into their current forms. In other words, according to Darwin, nature was the cause which eventually resulted in the change from random chemicals to the variety of life in our world today. The Bible warns us about people that would deceive us in order to keep us from God.
These verses from the Bible start by talking about people who call good things bad and bad things good. The passage gets pretty long and complex. My paraphrase of its essential truth is how terrible it is for people who twist the truth into lies and cause others to believe them, then think they are wise. Someone once said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. I call that proof by bold assertion. However, the truth, or error in evolution, is not what we're looking at now. In addition to Darwin, some of his contemporaries, like Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Lyell, also promoted these ideas. But, let's continue to go back further in time to see who may have actually originated the concepts that developed into our current evolutionary teachings.
As a result of pressure from others at that time, Darwin eventually admitted that William Wells, Patrick Matthew, and others were the sources for his ideas on the natural selection process. Although Darwin never admitted it, James Pritchard and William Lawrence also published works about natural selection in the same time frame. Darwin was probably also aware of their efforts. But they weren't the earliest works based on this philosophy either. Let's go backwards another 80 years.
As you can see from this list, there were a number of other earlier scientists that proposed evolution through natural selection. They envisioned that the rock layers captured the supposed progressive development of life forms in what many call the geologic column.
Stop. Hold on. What is a geologic column?
The geologic column is a graphic that supposedly shows what is under the ground, that is beneath our feet. It assumes that the Earth's rock layers have gradually and slowly accumulated since the Earth was formed. It also assumes that the simplest of living organisms, single cells and one-celled creatures, formed first in the history of the Earth. Their remains therefore can be found in the lowest layers of rock. As additional layers of rock were laid on top of them, the increasingly complex creatures that evolved during the time period of those layers were fossilized in them. Evolutionists teach that the geologic column shows the progressive evolution of life forms, from non-living chemicals to complex creatures on Earth. They believe that this took 4.5 billion years.
That is not actually the way fossils appear, in the rock layers. But that is not the point of our discussion. Our purpose is to talk about where, when, and through whom these evolutionary ideas started. As you look at this list of pro-evolution people, note that one of them was Erasmus Darwin. He was Charles Darwin's grandfather. Erasmus wrote about almost every part of the evolutionary process that is included in Charles Darwin's book. Sadly, Charles did not give even his own grandfather credit as a source of the main ideas he published. Also, it is interesting to note that all of these men, who advocated evolution's concepts, were vocal opponents of the Christianity, the Bible, and, particularly, a literal creation. So, how did the musings of atheists and occultists find fertile ground in a Christian culture? Let's go further back in time to find out.
Now, we will look at the impacts of intellectual elites during a period that covers about 1,000 years. Even though we will highlight only 4 of the men, there were others that joined them in this endeavor. The first one, Plotinus, although a pagan philosopher, has been described as having left a deeper mark on Christian thought than any other single person. 3 of the 4 were recognized as prominent Christian theologian philosophers. And, although they may have made significant contributions to Christianity, they also sowed the seeds that grew into acceptance of unbiblical evolutionary concepts. Efforts by these men to incorporate pagan ideas into Christianity included allegorizing the Bible scriptures, particularly the account of the creation.
They also focused on making Christianity relevant to their cultures. That meant making their Christian teaching consistent with the so-called truths of their society. This was seen in their explanations about the creation. They seemed to feel a need to make scripture compatible with the science of the day. It assumed that the educated elite were leaders in truths. This was particularly evident in Thomas Aquinas' role in semi-Christianizing the great chain of being. The great chain of being depicts how something called the One overflows and creates the world of ideas and the world soul. As overflowing continues, less perfect beings are formed until all possible varieties in a descending series are realized. This includes creating the angels, humans, animals, and then plants, and so on to the minerals. As you can see, the great chain of being is very similar in structure to the geologic column. Please note that the one at the top of the chain is not the one true God that we worship.
If you add these influences together, you get allegorized Genesis, naturalized explanation of creation, compromise with Greek natural science, and tied great chain of being in Aristotle's philosophy to European religious thought. Wow! What a mess! Summarizing, the combined effects of these influences is to subordinate scriptural understanding to the science and philosophies of the day. What man believes to be true changes with time. God's knowledge and understanding does not. In Colossians, Paul warned us to be careful that we are not led astray with false and empty teaching from only human reasoning, because it can come from the ruling spirits of this world, and not from Christ. To see where the great chain of being came from, let's go further back in time.
The Milesian School of philosophy provided the foundational beliefs that Plato and his student Aristotle would later build on. They believed that the Earth was only one of the many worlds contained in the universe that was undergoing a process of either development or decay. As part of this, they took the teachings about the formation of the worlds and codified them into the great chain of being. The actual chain they developed is much more complicated than the simple illustration we saw earlier. Aristotle's creation concepts are eerily similar to today's teaching of evolution. Although he believed that the universe itself has no beginning or end, he taught that the physical universe as we know it arose from a random interaction of atoms. While he gave lip service to the presence of a god, his god is an impersonal prime mover. One that just set the universe in motion and does not actively work in it anymore. Aristotle's earth is the world soul of the chain of being. Then, from it all things emanated in a descending stream. This is slightly different with today's evolution, where all things formed in an ascending order. To see where these ideas came from, let's continue to go back in time.
Now we have gone back another 1,000 to 1,200 years. Let's consider one of the oldest, if not the oldest, non-biblical written records that talks about the Earth's beginning. The Enuma Elish. It is the Babylonian story that includes how the Earth evolved. This is perhaps the source that the Milesian School based their evolutionary notions on. Some people call it a creation epic, but it does not actually deal with the creation. It begins with the existence of a watery universe. Nothing is created. Everything else will be formed from this water.
The Enuma Elish is a long and involved tale. However, we can summarize the basic steps that relate to the formation of our world. This early universe is described as chaotic water. It flowed and rocked back and forth. As it crashed against itself, it separated into three forms: sweet waters, a sea, and misty cloud banks. The waters swirled and picked up energy. As it became more powerful, two gods came into existence in the midst of it all. That is interesting. It teaches that there were two gods formed at the beginning, and from them everything else was made. The Genesis account of this initial part of the creation does not provide many details. It merely says that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but it was without form and was empty. God's Spirit moved over the waters. Then God created light, and the next day divided the waters into two parts. On the third day, He separated the waters from the land. But there are similarities between the Enuma Elish story and the biblical account. Water is prominent in both of them. If, and that may be a big if, Psalm 104 verses 1 to 5 is a chronological description of those early events in Earth's creation, it may help explain parts of the Enuma Elish. While the Genesis account seems to be more historical and fact-oriented, the Psalm, being poetry, is more figurative. It may be painting a picture of the first few days of the creation. On the first day, He creates the heavens and the substance of the earth, light, and moves on the face of the waters. On the second day, He separated the waters. And, perhaps in this watery disorder, is when He created the angels. And then on the third day, He made the dry land appear.
Did you ever wonder how Satan could possibly believe that he could have a chance of winning in a conflict against God? The Bible doesn't tell us, so we do not really know, but we can make some guesses. The Enuma Elish may include Satan's earliest remembrances of his beginning. Comparing Satan's creation in the Psalms with his account of his earliest remembrances may provide a solution. When Satan was created, he may have found himself in the chaotic waters. And God was there also. Rather than believing that God created both the waters and himself, Satan may have chosen to believe that both he and God were somehow formed out of the waters.
Do you remember that the Enuma Elish said two gods were formed in the waters? If he didn't want to accept that God created him, how could Satan account for his own existence? He may have decided that it must have been through some unexplained natural development process. Hence, he and the rest of the creation evolved. And if he believed that God was also a created being like him, then it would be only a matter of fighting it out to find out which of the two would be most fit for survival, and to determine who should reign over the rest of the creation.
We conclude that Satan was the first evolutionist. He was the one that spread his ideas of evolutionary development to all of the other men we mentioned today. Each one was brought to believe in an evolutionary process that was consistent with their own culture. They, and others like them, worked to spread this deception to people everywhere. The Bible tells us that, in the last days, Satan would deceive the whole world. One of his deceptions is to use evolution, with its purpose being to draw you away from God. Will you believe his lie?